Okay, I think we can begin. Luckily, the introduction duties were taken out of my hands, so we can just dive right into the conversation. I think, in case I wasn't introduced, I'm Mattie Kahn from ELLE magazine, and I wanted to start by talking to each of you about how you, before things were as good or medium as they are now, got into this industry. So, Leisha, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Mattie. Well, when I grew up in Ireland and I went to secondary school, actually, there wasn't an option of doing physics or maths. I went to an all-girls school. Well, we did maths, but not honours maths. So I came from a home where my mother was a stay-at-home mom, but she wanted us to all really take on subjects that were going to make a difference to us in our lives. So she encouraged us as children to study science. She also had a great love of nature, a great love of the outdoors, as did my father. So I think it was that really that influenced me to begin with an interest in science and to continue. And then I actually went on to study science in university, did a PhD in Trinity College, and began working in the pharmaceutical industry. Well, I did research actually for a number of years first, but it was I suppose, a fairly subtle encouragement into science from an early age.
But sometimes that can make all the difference. And
yes.
In terms of the messages that girls receive, there's the subtle messages to continue and pursue these careers, and then there are the not-so-subtle messages that this isn't really a place for you. So, Jessica, who was the person, or how did it come to be that you received the subtle message, this is where you belong?
Actually, mine was quite by accident. I was trained in economics and sociology, and that's I didn't plan to be in the infocom industry. I spent 27 years of my career in the infocom industry by stepping into it by accident, but I stayed in it. And I've just recently joined another industry, but I'll talk about that in a while. But that I did by accident, but I stayed in by choice because I realized that information technology and what it could do for both businesses and individuals, and it was just so amazing. And therefore, I stayed in and got in touch. So it wasn't as if someone said that you could or you couldn't do it, but the ability to see what it could do and what technology enabled just got me interested in it.
You were hooked. And Manuela, what about for you?
So I've always been interested in science, and I was originally interested in biology, but I learned, I grew up in Lisbon, this is my hometown, and I learned that the agricultural engineering school actually had the best biology training. So I ended up in agricultural engineering, and I discovered physics. I loved physics. I did all the physics I could take. And then I discovered economics. And I ended up doing agricultural engineering with a focus on physics and economics. And from then, I went on to do a PhD in economics in the US, in Silicon Valley and at Stanford, where I discovered IT. And I met Mr. Packard, Hewlett Packard. I met Mr. Jobs. And in a way, all of that synergy and that ecosystem of Silicon Valley created a huge interest in how to marry economics and technology. I now work at the World Bank, and a lot of what I do is to try and help other women get into STEM degrees and to STEM professions.
Jessica, I know that you have talked before about how important it is not only to welcome women into these industries at the job level, but how there needs to be some changes made into how we educate children to encourage women to be able to pursue these careers. So let's start with you, and then Leisha, I want to make sure we get to what Jansssen & Jansssen is doing. But what do you think that governments and ministries of education can do to make sure that there's equal opportunity for girls and boys right at the beginning of their educational careers?
Right. Well, you know, I have two roles. I have a role in government. I'm a member of parliament, and I look specifically in this area of talent, not just women in STEM, but also in my role in the industry as well. So I will say to you that it's not just governments, or it's not just companies, or it's not just the education system, but it's all three. So the ability to provide both the curricula and the foundations, which we're seeing, for example, in Singapore, where it's fairly gender neutral and there's a lot of focus on math and science. The challenge is getting our young people, and in fact, up to 2 to 3 years ago, getting our young people to choose STEM, let alone females. So that was one of the challenges. The second is also for companies to provide the platforms and for governments to be able to, not just from an education standpoint, but also from providing the environment and the ecosystem. So I'll give you an example. In Singapore, we have getting people to even look at the entrepreneurial aspects, the startup aspects, was not something that was so natural. So what the government did was provide a platform, an area and a platform for companies, startups, as well as incubators to come together, which we call the Launchpad. And by doing that, by providing that platform, by providing the support of workspaces as well as the policies that's around to support startups and incubators coming together, it's created such a vibrancy now in the last few years. The same thing with education, although I would say to you that it's because of role models, it's because of what's happening with digitalization that we are seeing people now wanting to sign up for STEM. Previously, even to get the boys to sign up for STEM wasn't as easy because there were options. In a tight labor market like ours, there are options, and the financial industry was getting some of the best talents previously. So it was only in the last few years. So we are seeing some uptake both for boys and girls, but more with the boys, and we've got to encourage the girls a bit more. We can talk about that later. But education, one of the areas, what companies do to provide the environment for both boys and girls to get excited, to try their hands in tech, and also for policies to support people coming together, providing the ecosystem, the platforms for them.
Yeah. So let's discuss what a company can do. You know, I think that the tendency is to imagine big corporations as kind of wanting to stay in their own lanes in terms of fostering talent and wanting to make sure they get the best people, which makes sense. But what can companies do to send a message about priorities and values in terms of the skills that a good, very diverse workforce should have?
I think it's a really good question, and I think to actually look at what Jansssen & Jansssen has done over the last number of years, we have I suppose an end-to-end approach to it, because as you say, it's not just about getting people in and keeping those, particularly keeping women in the workforce to develop up through the organisation, but it's much more about ensuring that we have a talent pipeline as well. And J&J is a very diverse type of business, from pharmaceuticals, medical devices to the consumer sector. And it needs a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers, a lot of technical people. So what we're doing, we have a program for younger students in schools. So this is for under 18s, between 12 and 18. So we work with not-for-profit organizations, and our volunteers go out into schools and run programs. We have a program called Science in a Box. We run that with junior achievement in some countries, with bridge to employment in other countries. So that's really about encouraging both boys, as Jessica has said, and girls to develop an interest and to maintain an interest in science. And then when you get to the university level, I suppose what we've seen with some of the statistics for Europe, that whilst 42% of the people that take up STEM-related subjects in university are women, what comes out the other end 10 years later when they're working is 3% of women. So you're losing a huge number of people between the start of university and 10 years into a career. You're losing a lot of women, actually, to STEM-related subjects. So we have a very specific program called Women in STEM, which we're running in 8 universities in the States, and then there's a program in Ireland, and there's a program in Tokyo and Brazil. And that's specifically looking at how we can keep women in STEM subjects in university and encourage them then into careers, sustained careers. And we've done some very specific research as to why women are not staying in STEM-related subjects. And And what we're hearing back is they feel isolated because they're often perhaps there's only one or two females in a class of 20, 25. And also the other area is that they don't feel confident enough to continue in that area. So we have a program of mentoring, and we have one-to-one mentoring with the students. And then finally, the last part of our program is actually within, when they're employed within J&J. And again, here we have another program to try and ensure that we keep those females engaged and keep them feeling confident to develop up within the organization.
Right. So we have two countries' perspectives and one corporation's perspective. Let's get the global perspective. You grew up in Portugal, and then you went to Silicon Valley, and now you're in Washington. You deal with a lot of different problems, I have to imagine, that are the barriers that are keeping women out of these fields, depending on where they're from. Certainly in the US recently, there's been conversation about education, but there's been a lot of conversation about just how unfriendly some of these workplaces are to women, and just how uncomfortable it can be to be a woman at a major Silicon Valley company, even as we kind of herald them as the future. How do you balance encouraging innovation, these principles of move fast and break things, and impressing on founders in the tech space that there are norms that must apply to make workplaces safe and supportive for women?
Let me start with a bit of a global perspective on creating an environment in which women are even interested in going into STEM. What we found working with about 180 countries around the world is that there are, at the very early stage, different types of stimulation that is actually applied to boys and to girls. And technology and science is all about foundations in science and math, but it's also foundations in creativity and arts. And all of that is applied very differently to boys and girls as they're growing up. And then there are countries in which girls are not even allowed to go to school or encouraged to go to school in study sciences because they are expected to go home after they graduate. Those are the women that we lose, and it's just not in the countries where we expect. We see it in Europe. We see labor force participation by women decline actually over the past 15 years. A lot of it is really about foundations. A lot of it is also about risk taking. And it's about standards. And so on standards, I'll talk a little bit about the World Bank, which is a 15,000 person organization where we have staff all over the world. And therefore, in each of the offices that we have, we actually work within the cultures of the place. And when you think about women in the labor force and women in STEM in particular, social norms really dominate how people interact in the labor force. So we have quite a bit of both in programs like Jansssen & Johnson. We have an entry-level program at which 50% of the entrants are women. They're assigned a mentor. There's quite a bit of training that all managers at the World Bank go through to be more conscious of their own biases and conscious of their biases that they may not be aware of. And I'll give you an example. If you have a number of applicants for a position, men and women, regardless of whether the hiring manager is a man or a woman, they will more often tend to hire men than to hire women. And if you subject even women to those unconscious biases training, you will find that women will often also reflect the social norms of the place they grew up in. And so there's quite a bit of effort in actually making sure that the hiring process is more blind to gender, but also that people are more aware of what social norms they bring with themselves. Then in terms of the projects that we finance, the World Bank finances a lot of investments in education and higher education and small and medium enterprises and startups. We have actually a very deliberate effort to support 50-50, and in some countries we actually go beyond 50-50. When you think about Middle East, North Africa, Pakistan, we actually make an effort to have a bias that is deliberate and explicit, but in the opposite direction.
It makes sense. I know that I feel it would be remiss not to address the newest way that the World Bank is financing women's initiatives, right? WeFi. Plenty of governments have signed on. It's sort of the face of it in America is Ivanka Trump, the first daughter. What can you tell us to begin about how that initiative came to be and what the World Bank expects to how it will bear out?
So what we were asked to do is, by a number of countries, including the US, was to host a fund that would fund women's entrepreneurship, and with a special emphasis actually in the Middle East and North Africa. And so part of the effort is really to try and provide some venture capital to women-led initiatives, which would be able to create environments in which women can work within their cultural setting, but in activities that would make the most out of the economic environment they're embedded in. And I'll give you an example. In Jordan, for example, we have actually provided a subsidy to companies that would hire more women, and for the first year, actually the bank will finance their salaries, and then in the second year, the companies will decide whether to keep those staff and to recruit them themselves, and in many cases they do. So it's something that tries to break a social norm where women are not naturally in these engineering positions or technology positions, and you just say, try them out and see how they work out, and sometimes they do. So the idea of this WeFi, to come back to your question, is really to try out a number of pilots and initiatives around the world, but with a focus on countries where women are less involved in labor force participation.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, I think all three of you have sort of touched on this this point that I feel comes up a lot. It comes up for us at ELLE a lot, this idea that women are naturally or have been conditioned to be more risk-averse than men. And I think there's an implicit dig in that we should be better risk takers. But on the flip side, we also know that the data says that women are better collaborators and that women are better at reaching conclusion. To me, it seems like sometimes we forget that those are maybe two sides of the same coin in some way, that that brash, like elbows out approach to doing business might make you more risk-friendly, but it doesn't help you arrive at a solution. In terms of each of your careers, how have you found those things balanced out? And do you think we're moving in a direction where companies are beginning to see collaboration and solutions-oriented leadership as like a good thing that you want to promote and endorse? We can start with you.
I think it's interesting what you're saying, but a recent McKinsey report would suggest that when you look at the leadership behaviors of men compared with the leadership behaviors of women, that actually some of the areas that women are better in are probably the ones that are going to be needed for the workforces of the future. Things like people development, things like collaborative decision making, actually, and so there are. I think there's a bit of a shift, and I think that's good for women. But I think when, I suppose I think back to my career and how you deal with that. I think one of the things that we need to be better at, and I think it's one of the areas that having more women in the room helps with, is listening to every voice. And I think that, often we don't listen to the quieter people, or we don't listen to perhaps a female or a male that's not as comfortable with giving their opinion as others. And I think that female leaders are more, in general, and it's a huge
We'll allow generalizations here.
generalization.
For the sake of the discussion, we'll permit
And
it.
you know, we can come back and talk about it again, but I think that for these conversations, what we need to get to is having men on the panel as well, actually, because I think it's not just a female issue. I think we do need to include more men. But I think that listening and having a real focus on encouraging all of our leaders to be better listeners will help with what you're talking about.
Yeah. Do you find that to be true, that are those norms the same in terms of the workplace in Singapore?
In fact, not just Singapore, but I think I'm going to take a flip side to this.
Okay.
I would say that before we talk about women as risk takers or collaboration, I think those are traits that are very important for leadership or for any role. But coming back to this tech discussion and coming to the STEM discussion, I think we should also look at the skills of both men and women with regards to STEM. And what research has found, and there's been lots of research in the last few years, a lot of meta-analysis in this space with regards to the fact that with regards to STEM, there's actually very small or even no difference between the capability of men and women or girls and boys. The challenge, though, is how do you then explain that gap of whether it's education or in jobs? And that difference, and a lot of studies have shown, the difference actually comes from the fact that the interest levels of girls and boys are different. So the interest of girls in terms of how STEM today is positioned, not that girls are not interested in STEM, but it's just how it's positioned both in the workplace and in education. And when there's been tweaks to that, to change the way either STEM is taught, or we talked about what J&J does, companies do these things around coding and all that. When you change the way it is brought across, you find that more girls get interested. And same in the workplace, when the work environment is kind of refined to tweak that interest of girls, then you get more entering the workforce. We've seen that in Singapore as well, because there's been very deliberate effort because of the need for STEM talent. We have seen in the last few years the take-up of women in ICT roles have gone up to about 30%. Not at 50% yet, but
America's lagging far behind. We don't have a leg to stand on.
No, but the fact is that when you make those changes, it affects interests. So I think the focus now has to be less on, is it education, is it government's role, is it companies' role, but what do these players do to then get the interest of the different groups? And where it's found to be done, and the analysis has shown, you will see women doing coming into and staying in STEM, either in education or in jobs. But the funny thing is, back to your point now, is that for the women who do choose to go into STEM and stay in STEM, and many do, like I've met quite a few here in the forums as well, is that they do very well. They do very well because of some of the traits that you just talked about, coupled with their talent in STEM. So I think for what Leisha has said, it's not a woman or a man issue, or we've got to look at that diversity and what it does for both the workforce and the economies if we get more women into STEM.
Right, right. And Manuela, what have you found, either in any particular country where you've worked or just in terms of the work and the data that the World Bank has taken in?
I think what we find around the world is not that different. It's a question of level. And of course, social norms and history and culture affect how women's participation, both in the labor force and in STEM in particular, matter. But what we have found is that women are discovering that a strong technical background is their best way out of dependence, out of having fewer choices in life. And so a lot of the effort we are making is really on those foundations, and it's on choice, agency. The hardest thing to fight is a sort of a stereotype of women that are that have very good soft skills and they're very collaborative, but do not have the technical foundations. And without the technical foundations, you have fewer choices. Right. And so investing in those technical foundations, but coupled with those characteristics that will make the jobs of the future, make them more competitive for the jobs of the future, that include adaptability, ability to adjust to different market conditions, to different labor forces, creativity. It's not enough to code. It's enough. It's good to know what to code for, and to have a bigger picture in mind, and risk taking. I think risk taking is something that that women. It's again, as you said, the flip side. It's both the collaborative side, the bringing people together side, but also knowing when to take a risk, when to take a jump, and to accept what comes on the other side.
Yes. There was a 10-year-old girl wrote an op-ed for the New York Times last week. Literally, she is 10 years old, about how she created a new Girl Scout patch for encouraging girls to raise their hand in class. And one of the things she said, and I was like, I guess I'm taking life lessons from a 10-year-old now, was that part of the reason girls don't raise their hands in class is because they don't want to get the wrong answer. They would rather not participate than risk saying the wrong thing in front of their classmates. It's easier just to be quiet. And I wonder how in each of your own lives you think you've kind of raised your hand and taken that risk, and what your advice is to women who are younger, who are just starting out, about how they can raise their hands and just put themselves up for the job, even if they don't know necessarily that they'll get it or that they're perfectly 10 out of 10 qualified for it. And since we've kept going in this order, Manuela, I'm coming back to you.
Sure. So I'll start with a bit of a nerdy answer.
My favorite kind of answer.
I read somewhere that women do better in math and science when they go to an all-girls school. I did. And it is true that you're less afraid to be wrong in front of your buddies, especially when you're 11, 12, 13. But I'll tell you what my experience was. I think what made the most difference for me was people give you a lot of advice throughout your life from early on. Hear it. Sometimes you hear the advice and you dismiss it. But people are often observing you and telling you, you think you have, I think you seem to be good at this. Why don't you try that? And I think that is the way out of the social norms in many ways. And then try things out that perhaps you wouldn't have thought you would be good at, and you discover a talent in. So.
Well, I would say that I'm one of those who's always, I wouldn't say put up my hand, but when I have been provided opportunities to try things, different things, initially it surprises me and shocks me, to say, hey, maybe not or no, but as I give it more thought, I normally I do take the opportunity, or I do try doing something that I totally think I'm not prepared for. And I've been surprised many times to realize that there are core skills that each of us bring into a situation. And that ability to learn and to adapt and to relearn has been something that has guided my choices along the way, both professionally and in the community as well. But I would say that maybe the one thing that we all should be very comfortable with is sometimes admitting that we don't know. And that is the best tool, because when you don't know and you go make an effort to find out, you suddenly realize how empowering that is, because you then get into trying, and then you apply the best of you. But I go back to Manuel's point on the point that if you're equipped with certain core skills, and in this case, as we're talking about STEM, being equipped with that foundationally helps give you the confidence to be able to try many different things. And in the digital economy, it's that core that will then allow you to apply your ideas, and that ability to make. It's not so much about making mistakes. It's not knowing what to expect sometimes that kinds of frightens you. But if you have those core skills and you adapt to it, it's actually quite empowering.
I think that's a great point. And Leisha?
Well, I'm the direct opposite to Jessica. I have a house full of self-help books, so I've been on that long journey.
Good, you
so
can bring us the
I-
expertise
I've,
from the field.
I have had all of those doubts and all of those concerns. Am I good enough? Am I good enough? But you just keep working on it and keep believing in yourself. And I think, you know, going back to the research that we did in as part of our program this year, it's really clear that when you look at the ability of boys and girls to achieve in science, and you look at their self-belief in how they can do, there's a complete mismatch. So there is a lot of work that we need to do with young girls to continue to encourage them to be confident and to be positive and to believe in themselves. And I think that's something that we have I suppose an obligation to do. And I think that you know, we're all doing it individually. And I think that we were at a meeting yesterday with European parliamentarians as well, and I think they're doing the women parliamentarians are doing some good work in this area as well. But we need to work together. You know,
Right.
there's a private sector piece, but there's also a public policy piece that we need to really join up our thinking and have a more, I suppose, aligned approach on how we can ensure that we keep women interested in STEM, because there is going to be a big economic gap in the future if we don't have more females working in the area. So I think there's an economic challenge as well as the responsibility, I think, that we have to young girls to help support them and encourage them to stay within STEM careers, because it's a great place to be.
Yes, I once went to a talk where a woman who will remain nameless said to a male executive, "Let me put this in terms you can understand. Your bottom line will be affected." And I think that at the end of the day, we want the best talent to be doing the best jobs and to be generating the best work. And it seems like, by all accounts, a more inclusive environment in terms of men and women and in terms of ethnic diversity too yields the best results. So I'm looking forward to everyone here carrying this great advice out with them and making sure that we get next year as close to 50-50 as possible.
Perfect.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.